Hello, my dear friends. Welcome to Hauntra. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and press the bell icon so that you don't miss any exciting coming up videos. Max had always been drawn to photography, capturing moments of beauty with his camera. He loved traveling to obscure places, seeking hidden gems of the world to document. One day, he stumbled upon an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of a forgotten village. The house was crumbling, vines creeping up its walls like fingers of time. It was eerily quiet, not a sound except for the wind whispering through broken windows. He felt a sudden thrill, an excitement that tingled through him as he prepared his camera. Max took several photos, capturing the decaying interiors, the cobweb-covered furniture, and the peeling wallpaper. But as he looked through the viewfinder to snap one last picture of an ornate mirror, something strange appeared in the reflection. A face. It wasn't his own. The pale, gaunt face of an elderly woman stared back at him, her eyes hollow and dark. Chilled, Max quickly turned around, expecting to find someone standing there, but there was no one. Only the house and its emptiness. Shaken, he packed up his camera and left, not realizing that the photograph he'd taken would forever change his fate. Max returned to his apartment that evening, the eerie feeling still lingering from the abandoned house. As he unloaded his camera gear, he took the memory card from his camera and plugged it into his laptop. The photo of the mirror caught his eye again. The face, it was undeniably unsettling, and the more he stared at it, the more he felt an inexplicable pull to the image. The woman's hollow eyes seemed to follow him, as if beckoning him closer. Shaking his head, Max tried to brush it off as a trick of light or his imagination. He had been in the house for hours after all, and had no idea how long it had been since he'd eaten or slept. As he began to close the photo, he noticed something strange. The woman's face was now smiling, her once haunting expression replaced with something almost sinister. Max's breath hitched and his fingers froze over the keyboard. It was too real, too vivid. Suddenly his phone rang, breaking his trance. But when he looked at the caller ID, it was an unknown number. He hesitated, but answered. Max picked up the call with a hesitant hello. On the other end, there was only silence, followed by a faint static sound. Then a whisper. "Help me." It was soft, almost a plea. Max's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced around the room, as if expecting someone to be standing behind him. The voice continued, now clearer, but still so faint it could have been a trick of the wind or the static on the line. "Who is this?" Max demanded, his voice trembling. But there was no response, only the sound of breathing. The same shallow, labored breath he had heard in the photograph earlier. His eyes darted to the screen, where the woman's face now looked even more twisted, her grin widening unnaturally. The phone clicked, and the call ended abruptly. Max's hands were shaking as he placed the phone down. He could feel a presence in the room now, something cold and oppressive. The hairs on his neck stood on end. He couldn't explain it, but it felt as though the woman in the photo had somehow crossed over from the reflection to reality. The next few days were a blur of unease and confusion. Max tried to ignore the incident, chalking it up to exhaustion. But the more he thought about the photo, the more obsessed he became with it. He couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was somehow connected to him, that her cold, lifeless stare was calling to him. That night, Max was sitting at his desk, editing some of his other photos, when a loud knock echoed through his apartment. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. It was nearly midnight. Who would be knocking at his door at this hour? Reluctantly, he opened the door, only to find no one there. But there was a cold breeze, and something caught his eye. A small, weathered envelope had been slipped under his door. Max picked it up, feeling an inexplicable chill seep into his bones. The envelope was plain, with no markings, and yet when he opened it, there was nothing inside but a single photograph. The photo was the same as the one he had taken in the abandoned house. But this time, there was something different. The woman's eyes were wide open, and they seemed to pierce through him, full of rage. Max could almost feel her breath on his skin. Max could barely sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the woman's face, her cold eyes boring into him, her smile stretched impossibly wide. The nightmare started almost immediately. He'd wake up in cold sweats, the memory of her face lingering in the shadows of his room. But it wasn't just in his dreams. Max began to feel her presence around him, an oppressive weight that he couldn't shake off. The air felt thicker, colder, as if something was watching him from the corners of his apartment. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he could hear faint footsteps echoing down the hallway. But when he checked, there was no one there. Desperate, Max began researching the house he had visited, hoping to find any connection to the photograph or the woman. The more he dug, the more unsettling the information became. The house had once belonged to a family. An elderly couple, to be exact. The woman, Clara, had disappeared mysteriously years ago. The town had assumed she had run away, but there were rumors. Some claimed she had never left the house. Others whispered that she had died there, her soul trapped in the reflection of the mirror. Max's obsession deepened. Max's obsession grew with each passing day. He couldn't stop thinking about the photograph, about Clara. It was as if he had unknowingly unlocked a curse, a dark force tied to the camera and the house. He began noticing strange occurrences around him. Objects moving out of place, shadows that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking, whispers that would vanish the moment he tried to listen. His friends and family noticed his change in behavior. His colleague, Sarah, expressed concern when he showed her the photo. "Max, I think this is getting out of hand," she said, her voice trembling as she looked at the image. "Maybe you should just burn it. Destroy it." But Max couldn't. The woman in the photo had a hold on him, and every time he tried to look away, he was drawn back to her. The photo had become his obsession, his prison. Then, one night, as he was sitting alone in his apartment, the camera flashed to life on its own. The lens turned toward him, and he snapped a picture of himself. The photograph appeared on the screen a moment later, and to his horror, he was not alone in the frame. The woman, Clara, stood behind him, her hollow eyes locked on his. Max couldn't escape the photo. Everywhere he went, he saw Clara's face. It was on the subway, on billboards, even in the reflection of windows as he passed by. The images taunted him, reminding him that he could never truly escape. The curse had followed him, growing stronger with each day. But what terrified him more was that Clara's image seemed to be changing. It wasn't just a photo anymore. It was alive. Max began to see her at the corner of his eye, just out of sight, but always there. In the mirror, on the street, in the crowd. It was as if she was everywhere, watching him. Sleep-deprived and paranoid, Max knew he had to act. He couldn't let this continue. But how do you fight a curse? How do you destroy something that no longer existed in the physical world? That night, he set out for the abandoned house again, determined to find a way to break the cycle. Max's heart raced as he approached the crumbling house once again. It had been days since he'd last been there, but the urge to return felt overwhelming. It was as if the house itself was calling to him, drawing him back. The air was thick with a sense of dread. The same feeling he had experienced when he first arrived. The wind howled through the broken windows, carrying with it the scent of decay. Max stepped carefully inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The house was exactly as he remembered, dusty, silent, and abandoned. But there was something different this time. The oppressive feeling in the air was even stronger, more suffocating. As he made his way deeper into the house, the temperature seemed to drop, the cold biting into his skin. The floor creaked beneath his feet, and his breath came out in visible puffs. He knew what he had to do. He had to confront the source of the curse, the mirror. The ornate mirror in the dusty corner of the living room. Max walked toward it, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the glass. As he gazed into the reflection, he half expected to see Clara standing there again, but the mirror remained empty. Or so he thought. When he looked closer, he noticed something was off. The reflection of the room was distorted, like it was warped by something unseen. Max's breath caught as he stared at the mirror. At first, he thought it was his imagination playing tricks on him. The room seemed to warp in unnatural ways, the walls bending at odd angles, the floor rising and falling like waves. But as he looked closer, he realized it wasn't a trick. Something was behind the glass, something that shouldn't be. In the reflection, Clara's face appeared again, pale, gaunt, her hollow eyes staring at him. But this time, she wasn't smiling. Her expression was one of pure anger. The image in the mirror shifted, the edges blurring like smoke. Max's hand trembled as he reached out, touching the cold surface of the glass. It felt wrong, as if the mirror wasn't solid, but some kind of window into another world. Suddenly, a sharp, cold hand grasped his wrist. Max screamed and yanked his hand back, stumbling backward. The air in the room had become thick and suffocating, and the mirror seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Clara's image twisted and contorted, her mouth opening wide as if to scream, but no sound escaped. Max backed away, his mind racing. The mirror wasn't just a reflection, it was a portal, and Clara wasn't the only thing trapped inside. Max stumbled backward in terror, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed. The mirror was no longer just a reflection of the room. It was alive, its surface rippling as if it were breathing. Clara's face had become even more distorted, her eyes now completely black, her mouth opening wider with every passing second. His heart pounded in his chest, and every instinct told him to run. But he couldn't. Something held him there, drawing him closer to the mirror. Max's fingers itched to touch it again, to understand what was happening, but his mind screamed at him to stay away. Suddenly, the mirror cracked, a jagged line appearing down the center of the glass. Max gasped, stumbling back as a dark shadow began to crawl out from the broken surface. It was not just Clara, it was something worse, something ancient and malevolent. The shadow twisted and morphed, its form taking shape like a mass of dark tendrils reaching out toward him. Max's mind screamed for him to run, but his body refused to obey. The shadow's cold, clammy fingers brushed his skin, sending a jolt of icy terror through him. He was paralyzed, unable to move as the darkness consumed him, drawing him closer to the mirror. Max gasped for air, his lungs burning as if he were drowning. The shadow had completely engulfed him, dragging him toward the mirror's surface. It was no longer a reflection, it had become a prison. Max's vision blurred, and he felt himself slipping away from reality. He could no longer see the house, only the vast emptiness of the dark void inside the mirror. The cold hands of the shadow tightened around him, pulling him deeper into its grasp. His body felt numb, disconnected, as though he were floating in a place beyond time and space. He could hear Clara's laughter now, a low, haunting sound that echoed in the darkness. It wasn't just her voice. There were others too. Countless whispers filled the air, the voices of those who had been trapped in the mirror before him. "Help me," the voice whispered, and Max realized it was his own. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was trapped, bound to the mirror, unable to escape. The darkness closed in on him, and all he could do was wait, knowing that soon his face would join the others in the reflection, forever trapped in the cursed glass. Back in the real world, Sarah, Max's closest friend, had been trying to reach him for days. After his sudden disappearance, she grew increasingly concerned. She knew something had happened, something Max hadn't shared with her. She had seen the photo of Clara, and she had seen the change in him. It was as if he had been consumed by the curse. Determined to find Max, Sarah tracked down the old house, hoping to uncover the truth. She stood at the threshold, the dilapidated structure looming before her like a dark specter. As she stepped inside, the air grew heavy, the silence almost deafening. The house was still, but Sarah could feel it, a presence, something watching her from the shadows. She carefully made her way through the rooms, her eyes scanning the walls, the dusty floors. When she entered the living room, her eyes fell on the mirror. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the same mirror from Max's photo, the one he had shown her days before, and now it seemed to be calling to her. Without thinking, Sarah stepped toward it. As her fingers brushed the surface, she felt a sharp coldness. And then she saw it. Max's face, pale and ghostly, staring back at her from the reflection. Sarah's heart raced as Max's face stared back at her from the mirror. She froze, unable to look away. His expression was one of fear, his eyes wide and filled with silent pleading. She could feel the cold seeping into her skin, her breath fogging in the frigid air around the mirror. The whispering voices grew louder as if they were trying to communicate, to warn her. "Don't touch it. Don't let it take you." The voice was faint, but Sarah could hear it clearly, coming from within the mirror. She stepped back, shaking her head in disbelief. It wasn't just Max's face. The reflection of the room had changed. The walls warping in unnatural ways, the floor rising and falling as if the mirror was a gateway to something far darker. The reflection was no longer a mere glass. It was a portal. Suddenly, Max's face twisted in agony, and he reached out as if trying to break free from the mirror. His voice echoed in her mind, desperate. "It's too late. Help me, please." Sarah's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, trembling. She couldn't stay here, couldn't stay near the cursed mirror. But as she turned to leave, she felt an icy grip on her ankle. A cold, unnatural force was pulling her back, dragging her toward the mirror. It wasn't just Max. It was the curse, the ancient evil that had been awakened. Sarah struggled, trying to free herself from the grip of the unseen force. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The pull was too strong, dragging her toward the mirror with terrifying force. She clawed at the floor, but it was as if the ground itself was shifting beneath her. The room around her was no longer familiar. It felt as though the very space was bending and warping, its dimensions changing. The shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, and the air became thick with a sense of impending doom. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to comprehend what was happening. A cold wind howled through the room, and the mirror's surface rippled as though something was moving within it. She could feel the presence of something immense, something ancient and evil, watching her, waiting for her to give in. "No, I won't," Sarah screamed, summoning every ounce of strength to break free from the force. She dug her fingers into the floorboards, using all her willpower to pull herself away. But the darkness was relentless. It seemed to feed off her fear, growing stronger with every attempt to resist. Sarah could feel herself weakening, her vision blurring as the cold seeped deeper into her skin. Just as Sarah felt herself being pulled into the mirror, a voice broke through the chaos. Max's voice, clearer now, as if he was speaking directly to her. "Sarah, you have to stop. You're the only one who can end it." Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide in terror. Max's face, still distorted in the mirror, was filled with both pain and desperation. He was trapped, forever bound to the cursed glass. The shadowy tendrils twisted around him, pulling him deeper into the mirror's void. "What do I need to do?" Sarah cried out, her voice trembling. Max's reflection seemed to flicker, his face becoming more translucent as the shadows consumed him. "The mirror, it needs to be destroyed. It's the only way." The words sent a surge of clarity through Sarah's mind. She understood now. The mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a conduit, a vessel for the ancient evil that had been sealed away for centuries. To break the curse, she had to destroy it, no matter the cost. But how? The mirror was no ordinary object. It had a power that went beyond anything Sarah could comprehend. Sarah looked around, her mind racing for a solution. The room was dim, the shadows deepening with every passing second. The mirror pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, its surface rippling as if alive. She had to do something, anything, to stop the curse from claiming her like it had claimed Max. She stood up, her body trembling with fear but also determination. She had to act now, before it was too late. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for something, anything that could help her. And then she saw it, an old brass candlestick, lying abandoned on the floor. It wasn't much, but it was the only weapon she had. Grabbing the candlestick, Sarah turned back to the mirror. The darkness had almost fully consumed the reflection of the room, leaving only a swirling void. Max's face was now barely visible, his form flickering in and out of existence. Without hesitation, Sarah raised the candlestick and struck it against the mirror's surface. The metal clanged against the glass, sending a shockwave of energy through the room. The mirror trembled, but it didn't break. The dark tendrils lashed out, as if angry at being disturbed. But Sarah didn't stop. She hit the mirror again, harder this time, the candlestick cracking against the glass. The mirror's surface began to shudder, as if it were alive, trying to resist the destruction. With each strike, the mirror seemed to weaken. The tendrils writhed in anger, but Sarah's resolve only strengthened. She had to finish this, no matter what. Max's ghostly form faded with every hit, his presence becoming less and less solid. The whispers of the trapped souls grew louder, urging her on, desperate for release. The next blow cracked the surface of the mirror. A loud, deafening sound filled the room, and for a moment, Sarah thought she had done it. But the mirror didn't shatter completely. Instead, the cracks began to pulse, glowing with a sickly green light. Max's face appeared again, this time screaming in agony, his form twisting in the glass. "It's not enough," he cried out, his voice distorted by the dark power within the mirror. The cracks deepened, spreading like a spider's web across the surface. Sarah took a deep breath, her hand shaking as she prepared for the final strike. With every ounce of strength she had left, she swung the candlestick one last time. The mirror shattered. The room was filled with a deafening crash as the mirror shattered, its pieces scattering across the floor. The tendrils that had once reached out for Sarah disappeared, dissolving into the air like smoke. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the house seemed to breathe again, the weight of the curse finally lifting. Sarah collapsed to the ground, exhausted but alive. She could feel the air around her change, the heavy presence that had plagued the house now gone. Max's face was no longer visible in the shards of glass. The whispers had stopped. The house was silent, save for the sound of her own ragged breathing. Max had been freed, along with the others who had been trapped within the mirror for so long. The curse had been broken, but at what cost? Sarah had lost her friend, and she had no way of knowing if he would ever truly return. She stood up, her body shaking from the ordeal. The house was quiet now, but she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence in the house was almost suffocating. The oppressive air had dissipated, leaving only the lingering echoes of what had happened. Sarah slowly stood up, her knees weak, her body trembling from the ordeal. The shards of glass littered the floor around her, but none of them reflected the same horrors they had just moments ago. It was as though the mirror had never existed. But Sarah knew better. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she walked across the room. The house no longer felt like a prison, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. The curse had been broken, but the darkness wasn't gone. It had merely been freed from the mirror. It was out there now somewhere, lingering in the corners of the world, waiting for the next unwitting soul to find it. Max was gone. His voice, his face, had faded from her mind the moment the mirror shattered. She couldn't even remember his smile, his laugh, the sound of his voice anymore. It was as if the curse had stolen him completely, erasing his existence from her memory. She couldn't stay here. Not anymore. Sarah knew she had to leave the house, but the question of where to go lingered in her mind. She didn't know if she would ever escape the fear, the lingering sense of something dark and malevolent that would follow her wherever she went. Days passed, and Sarah tried to move on. She returned to her life, but the trauma of that night never fully left her. It clung to her like a second skin, always there, just beneath the surface. She couldn't escape the nightmares that plagued her sleep, the images of Max's twisted face, and the whispers that still seemed to echo in her mind. One night, as she sat alone in her apartment, the soft glow of the streetlights casting long shadows through her window, she heard a faint whisper. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but then it came again. This time, it was unmistakable. Sarah. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was faint, but it was there. It was Max's voice. He was calling to her, reaching out from beyond the grave. She stood up, her hands shaking as she looked around the room, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Sarah, it's not over. The realization hit her like a cold wave. The curse had been broken, but Max's spirit was not at peace. He was still trapped, still suffering, somewhere in the darkness beyond the mirror. The house may have been free, but the evil was far from gone. With a gasp, Sarah ran to the door. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to find Max. She had to finish what she started, even if it meant confronting the evil once more. She wasn't sure how, but she knew that she couldn't leave him behind. Thanks for watching, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for more new videos.